All right, so here are 3 quick exercises that you can do to help you practice your saturation and dilution control with watercolor painting. I just have a little piece of like scrap paper where I do a lot of test swatches. I highly recommend keeping a hold of a piece of paper that you don't care about, but is the same as your watercolor paper, because trying this on like a piece of printer paper is not going to come out the same. You have to know how your paint works on your paper. So we have a paint palette with various colors. I have dried paints in the pans. This is kind of important because wet paints are going to have a very different consistency on the paper. So I'm going to choose any random color, doesn't matter. For right now, I'm going to use a small round brush with a fine point. Let's see. Okay, I'm going to get this one. So I want to saturate with paint quite a bit here, to the point where you can see even on this black bristles, these black bristles, that I have pretty decent amount of paint there. So the first exercise, we're going to do 5 little squares, and each time we're going to add just a tiny little dab of water to each square. This is kind of just to see what happens. To some degree, your paint and your paper are going to work differently than mine are. Okay, so there's my first swatch, pretty saturated, pretty dark even. I'm just gonna dip my paintbrush into the clean water. Do my second swatch. Dip paint into the paint water, or the clean water, sorry. Third swatch, we're getting just a little bit lighter every time, not too much. Second swatch. Or second to last. And then finally for the last one. Okay. Now, if you wanted to, you could take this further and you can keep going until you get to like almost white, just to see how light your paint can get. Knowing what each of your paint colors will look like at different saturations is quite helpful for knowing how your paint is going to look on your finished piece. Okay, so that's the first exercise. The second one is to do a paint swatch just with this scrubbing action. So we're kind of holding the brush like a pencil. This is pretty much always how you're going to want to hold your brush. You never want to push the bristles down into the paper. You always want to pull and drag. And so same motion that we did for these, but then we're just going to create one long strip, just seeing how quickly the paint goes from dark to light. So I'm going to use the same color, and I want to start off with a pretty similar saturation to this. So I want approximately the same paint to water ratio in my brush. Okay, a little bit of that scrubbing motion side to side or up and down, slowly moving my brush to the side. And I have this really chunky paper, so you can see that this is getting kind of speckly. If this were a painting, this would probably be the point where I would say, okay, let's get some water and see what happens when that looks thinned out. But that's going to be the next exercise. So the further I go, the more my brush gets dry, and I start to get this what's called the dry brush effect, which is where you have kind of like speckly textured paint strokes. This is good to know. This is great for creating textures if you're going for something a little more photoreal, or even just to give your painting a little something extra. But basically, the dry brush stroke involves a brush that doesn't have a whole lot of water in it and a decent amount of paint. So it's kind of almost like painting with acrylic paint, right? Where your brush doesn't have a whole lot of water and it's loaded up quite a bit with paint. Okay, so then for the final exercise, we're going to do one of these little squares down here, and then we're going to use water to blend it out. And the goal is to try to create as smooth a strip as you can. So same color, just for continuity's sake. I am going to do that little square over here. I want it to be fairly saturated, fairly wet, but not like super wet. So this is about the consistency of like canola oil maybe. And now I'm gonna dip my brush in my clean water. Hopefully I'm not dirtying up my clean water too much, but I can always go get more later. And I'm going to load it up with water just to the point where it's full of water, but it's not dripping. You can't really see, but there's no threat of dripping here. And then I'm going to grab this. I should have worked a little bit faster. I'm going to grab this and see how smoothly I can create a gradient. I am going to need to go back for water every once in a while. Okay. But the trick is knowing how much water you need in your brush. Unfortunately, it's not really something I can just tell you because your paper and your paint and your brush is all going to be different. So you're going to want to practice this enough that you kind of get the sense of like how your paint works, how your paper works, and how it all feels to learn how control works for you and also what level of control you want. Okay, so just real quick little thing here. Because part of the goal of this exercise is to know how it feels, but also to get a smooth gradient, maybe you want to kind of lighten this up a little bit. So I'm dipping my brush, I cleaned off my brush and I've dipped it in clean water. I'm gonna just gently dab it on my paper towel here, my towel. And I'm gonna use that clean water to kind of lift up and lighten up this stuff on the end here to get my gradient just a little bit stronger, because right now it's kind of evening out from about here over. Okay, quite a bit of water there. And then I'm going to reabsorb it into my brush, dab it off, reabsorb it into my brush, and dab it off. Every time I use my brush to reabsorb the water, this is called, or paint, this is called lifting. And lifting works best if you kind of clean off your brush in between. So, and this is something that I often see people forgetting to do, is when you're lifting, you lift and you dab. Otherwise, you're just going to keep moving the paint around, and that's not necessarily what you want. Okay, so I'm going to just smooth this out a little bit more. I am going to need to start all the way from the left side because it's too dry at this point. That I would get a cauliflower. And that is a pretty decent gradient. It's not quite how I wanted it to be, but it's close enough. Okay. All right. Feel free to drop questions in the comments section. Bye.